Hello, and welcome to Episode 4 of Sarastro's Kingdom Death Monster painting series. In this episode we're going to paint the Butcher from Adam Poot's Kingdom Death Monster. The Butcher is a fearsome adversary and an interesting figure to paint. I've chosen to have a play with some grungy textures, non-metallic metal effects, and of course some object source lighting. Please note that because of the number of different elements covered, you may find the time-stamped index in the video description useful when returning to look at how I've painted the different parts of the model. Let's take a look at the painting stages. After assembling the Butcher and providing some texture for the base, I've chosen to prime the figure in black, followed with some grey and white zenithal highlights applied from above. I've also chosen to give all of the lanterns an undercoat of pure white, which is something I'd highly recommend in order for the yellow to really achieve maximum brightness, and can just as easily be done with a brush if you like. Next I'm going to apply the base colours, which will be predominantly quite dark, in order for me to more easily control the contrast levels when highlighting up. I'll then be working from section to section, building up the highlights and textures, and adding some shade as needed. I'll be having some fun with some object source lighting, as well as providing some heavily textured non-metallic metal effects for the armour, as well as their weapons. Since I've based and primed the figure as described in episode 2, let's begin with the base colours. I'm going to begin by painting all of the lanterns yellow. I've chosen scale colours Marduk Yellow for this, but you could use whatever yellow you like. Once again, I must stress that however you choose to prime your model, we really want to ensure that the lanterns have a white undercoat if you want the yellow to stand out. You can see I'm also painting over the skins that we can see stretched across some of the lanterns. I'm now going to use Ratskin Flesh to paint the skins. I'm thinning this with a couple of drops of Larmian medium to help it flow into the recesses a bit like a shade, leaving the flatter, more stretched out areas to allow more of the yellow to show through. I'm now painting some of the eye and mouth holes in white, to be followed with a touch of yellow. For the body of the lanterns, I'm going to use a non-metallic metal approach, and I'm creating a base tone using a mix of dark sea blue, USA Olive Drab, and black. You could use pretty much any dark grey or off-black tone for this, or indeed use a dark metallic paint like I did for the prologue survivors in episode 1. I've now chosen to introduce some tonal variation in the yellow by shading the windows with a little Casandora Yellow. This is pretty optional however, as we'll be making some more controlled adjustments here in a while. Next I'm going to paint all of the skulls using Vallejo's Brown Violet, mixed with a little Naggaroth Night and some white. This will include the skulls on the back, as well as the pauldron and helmet. For the fur cloak, I'm using USA Olive Drab, which I'm mixing with just a little Naggaroth Night and some black. You may notice I'm often adding purple to my darker tones. This is because I like how it complements the more yellowy light of the lanterns. I'm also using this for the sections of fur we can see on the arms. For the golden mask, I'm using Vallejo's Japanese uniform, which I'm desaturating with a little black. For the metal armour, I'm creating a base tone using dark sea blue, mixed once again with a little Naggaroth Night and some black. Before painting the plate armour, I'm going to thin some of this down with a little medium and use it to colour the chainmail we can see on the upper chest and on the forearms. This is just to allow the raised texture to remain quite light. I'm also using this for the armour hanging at the front. I'm now painting the plate armour using a more solid consistency. Just as with the lanterns, you may prefer to use a dark metallic paint here instead if you like. I'm also using this for the metal spikes on the helmet and left shoulder. For the blades of the cleavers and the saw, I'm using a roughly equal mix of dark sea blue and German grey. And I'm now returning to the bone colour we used earlier to paint the sections of bone we can see on the cleavers. For the strips of fabric we can see on the arms, I've chosen to use quite a light tone of deck tan mixed with a little USA Olive Drab to help break things up a bit. For the faces we can see stretched across the stomach, I'm using Bugman's Glow mixed with Deathworld Forest. And I'm now filling in the gaps created by the eyes and mouth with the armour tone. I've also chosen to paint the handle of the saw in the bone colour. And for the belt, I'm using English uniform mixed with a little black. I later decided to use this for the strap on the right cleaver, and you can of course paint this now. I'm now using the pale fabric tone we mixed a moment ago to paint the strap holding the central cleaver in place. And I'm using USA Olive Drab for the handle. For the fabric on the upper leg, I'm using a mix of dark sea blue and USA Olive Drab. I want some cooler tones here to contrast against the warmth of the upper body caused by the lanterns. Here I'm just painting the remaining handle with the USA Olive Drab. I've also chosen to paint the butcher's hands using the same skin tone we used for the faces a moment ago. And for the hanging pouches, I'm using Storm Vermin Fur. The main thing I'm trying to achieve when choosing colours for the various parts of the torso is to make the details readable by separating the elements out using simple contrasts of light and dark. But I'm also using fairly neutral colours that aren't going to steal attention away from the more interesting parts of the model. For the metal rings we can see on the legs, I'm using the same Japanese uniform and black mix we used for the mask. And for the small area of inner helmet, I'm using USA Olive Drab. Finally, I'm going to block in some colours for the base, using USA Olive Drab, dark sea blue and some black. You can see that I'm applying this somewhat thinly and using the more blue-grey tones for the rocks and the more brownish tones for the surrounding earth. With the base colours complete, we're ready to begin adding some highlights, texture and shade. I'd like to begin by highlighting the mask, but before I do, I've chosen to use a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Druchii Violet to help give a little definition to the eyes. We can also use this to bring some depth and definition to some of the details on the skulls. I'm now going to begin highlighting the mask using pure Japanese uniform. I'm going to lighten this with the addition of some ivory in a few stages. I'm going all the way up to pure ivory to create the suggestion of a shiny finish. Next I'm going to highlight the skulls, but I'm first making a correction to the left pauldron with the base metallic tone, as I've noticed the rim and fastenings should actually be metal. To create my skull highlight tone, I'm going to be adding some German camo orange ochre along with some deck tan to the original base tone. This is going to cover most of the raised and flat areas of bone. We can now lighten the mix further in a few stages. Because this is possibly quite old and worn, the textures don't have to be especially smooth. The brightest highlights I'm adding are almost pure deck tan. I'm not going any brighter, however, as I'd like to reserve those brighter extremes for the metallic areas of the model. For the areas of skull that are closest to the lanterns, I'm now going to mix some Troll Slayer orange into some Marduk Yellow and use this to add a little object source lighting. I'm also using some Naggaroth Night mixed with a little black to help add definition to some of the cracks and recesses, and to boost the level of purple in some of the shadows. I'm now using the same tones to highlight the bones on the cleaver, and also for the handle of the saw. Next I'm going to highlight the metal lanterns by simply adding increasing amounts of ivory to the blue, brown and black base tone. Naturally, I'm shrinking the highlights down the brighter I go. I'm also taking into account the areas of metal that would be hit by the light from the neighbouring lanterns. I'm not overthinking these highlights, I just want to ensure that there's enough contrast to give the overall impression of a metallic finish. I'm finishing these highlights off with a few small glints of pure ivory. I'm now going to add a little white to the Marduk Yellow and use this to brighten the lower area of the windows of each lantern. And I'm now using a more orangey tone for the upper part of each window. With that done, I'm now going to use some orange to introduce some object source lighting to the lanterns themselves. To finish the lanterns off, I've chosen to add a few touches of rust with the Secret Weapon rust paints, using mostly the old rust and red rust colours. This is entirely optional, of course. Before highlighting the fur cloak, I'm going to shade the area with a roughly 2:1 mix of Agrax Earthshade and Druchii Violet. We obviously want the cloak to be nice and dark in order to allow the lanterns to really shine, and the shade will also help articulate the texture for us. Here I've chosen to thin the shade down with a couple of drops of medium, and I'm now applying it to the arms and the torso area, as well as the fabric on the legs. This is just to darken the recesses and help separate out the elements. I'm now going to begin highlighting the cloak by firstly adding some brown violet to the original base tone. At this stage I'm simply picking out the main raised strands of the texture, except for the lowest area of the cloak which is furthest from the lanterns. I'm now using pure brown violet and I'm focusing on the more prominent strands of the texture, especially those that are nearest to the lanterns. For the areas of fur closest to the lanterns, I'm going to mix in varying amounts of light orange and German yellow. I've chosen these colours as they're less saturated than the tones I used for the lanterns themselves, and the German yellow is especially opaque, which makes it ideal for picking out the raised details. You can see I'm varying the tone to best match the colour of the lanterns, so here for example I'm going a bit more orange. At no point however do I want the fur to be as bright or saturated as the lanterns themselves. If you do go too bright, we can use some of the brown and purple shade to tone the highlights down. I'm now moving on to the armour, and I'm going to begin by mixing some brown violet into the original dark sea blue, Naggaroth Night and black base tone. I'm starting by mapping out the main areas of highlight, and here on the right pauldron I want a main roughly circular overhead highlight, and a secondary more vertical highlight near the back to show the light being caught from the lanterns. I also want to use a thinner highlight to define the lower rim. Elsewhere on the upper body it should be fairly obvious to see where the highlights would look most natural. I'm now moving on to the legs. With the main areas of highlight mapped out, we can now begin lightening the tone, firstly by adding additional brown violet. I'm aiming for a fairly grungy and textured look, so I'll often be applying the tones using stipples and small scratchy strokes. Even in the areas of shadow, I might place some smaller secondary reflections or highlights. It's also important to ensure that all of the edges are well defined. I'm now going to begin adding some ivory along with some light orange to lighten things further. Naturally, I'm going to be building the highlights up quite far for the areas of armour closest to the lanterns on the chest. You can see that I'm freely adding some noise and scratchy textures along the way. We can of course return to our darker tones at any time to adjust things to our liking. To prevent the armour from becoming too gold looking, I've chosen to now add a cooler tone, Vallejo's light green blue. You can see I'm now working on quite small areas of highlight, whilst continuing to add small dents and scratches along the way. Finally, I'm going to add some ivory for my brightest highlights. Now that I'm happy with the level of contrast, I'm going to begin playing with the colours, and I'm starting by using some of the Troll Slayer Orange and Marduk Yellow mix to add some object source lighting. I'm now going to add some rusty tones, once again using the secret weapon rust paints. Here I'm using a mix of the orange and red rust tones. I'm starting somewhere discreet to see how I like the colour before using it on the more prominent areas of the model. These tones can be glazed on very thinly over larger areas, or applied in a more concentrated, localised way. Here I'm trying the old rust colour, which has a more purplish hue, making it a nice choice to place in the shadows. I'm now adding some additional scratches and blemishes. To add some further variety, I've chosen to have a play with some inks. In particular, I'm going to use some cooler tones to contrast with the warmer oranges and browns. I've thinned all of these with a roughly equal amount of water, and I'm starting with a mix of black and violet inks by scale colour. You can see I'm using this to bring some depth to the darker areas, and I also like how this purpley tone complements the yellows in the highlights. Next I'm trying some thinned dark green ink by Dela and Rowney, which I'm applying quite selectively, mostly into some of the mid-tones. I'm now adding some additional grungy noise and scratches. And I'm continuing to play with the various elements already introduced until I'm happy with the overall look. And this completes the armour. I'm now going to highlight the various elements on the torso area, and I'm starting with the skin, which I'm going to lighten with a mix of Bugman's Glow and increasing amounts of Nurgling Green. I'm also adding some of the orange and a little ivory for the brighter highlights. And I've chosen to use some neat Druchii Eye Violet to better define the creases in the texture. For the belt, I'm starting the highlights with some pure English uniform. I'm once again lightening this with the addition of some ivory, along with some of the Trollslayer orange and Marduk Yellow mix. Here I'm adding some Nurgling Green along with some additional yellow for my final highlight. I'm going to finish the belt off by mixing some Inktense Violet and wood tones with some water and use this to create some depth as well as a slightly glossy sheen. And I've chosen to give the skin a final boost with some Nurgling Green and Marduk Yellow. Next I'm mixing some pale grey tones, which I'm going to use to pick out the sections of chainmail using the side of the brush tip. I'm using this very bright tone for the sections that I feel would catch the light from the lanterns. We can now brush some orange on top to create our object source lighting. I'm now highlighting the strips of fabric on the arms using the Dectan and USA Olive Drab base tone. And here I'm once again using some orange to show the light being caught from the lanterns, as it's important to be consistent when creating object source lighting. To highlight the pouches, I'm adding some Nurgling Green to the Storm Vermin Fur base tone. And now with a little of the orange for the top of the pouch on the left. And finally some Druchii Eye Violet to add some shade to the underside. With that done, I'm now going to paint the cleavers. I'm going to begin by adding some brown violet and a little white to the original German grey and dark sea blue base tone. I'm now beginning to map out my highlights. I don't have a definite plan here, but generally want to create contrast between the tones of the sharpened blade and the broad flat areas, which I'll also be adding a fair bit of rust and weathering to in a moment. I'm lightening this gradually with the addition of further brown violet and white. You can see I'm still playing around with the addition of some further, smaller highlights at this stage, and I'm using a series of short strokes to create a kind of brushed metal texture. Here I'm using an intermediate tone to smooth out this transition. I'm now adding some German yellow to push the highlights further. I'm also using the side of the brush tip to easily catch all of the edges of the blades. I'm now adding some of the light green blue to create some subtle variations in tone and temperature. And I'm also now beginning to add some initial scratches. Next I'm adding some ivory to place my brightest highlights. And I'm now using pure ivory. Before playing with the colours further, I'm going to use a dark sea blue and black mix to push the depth in the darker areas. I'm now going to add some thin touches of colour to the blades, and for a more steely look, I've chosen to add some bluish green tones. Here I'm adding a small hint of Vallejo's Emerald, which we can feather out with a damp brush. And now some blue-green. I'm applying these tones quite sparingly and trying not to go over the brightest areas of highlight. I'm now using the Marduk Yellow with a little orange to add some warmer highlights and object source lighting. Next I'm returning to the rust colours to add some rust effects, mostly to the flat sides of the blades. I also might incorporate some of the brown violet whilst doing this. Here I've chosen to use some of the dark green ink to add some further variety. You can be as heavy or as light as you like with these effects. I'm going for quite a weathered look, but I'm still allowing some of the brighter highlights such as we can see here to remain. Because the torso area is already so busy, I've chosen to keep the cleaver strapped to the belt fairly smooth and clean looking. I'm now reinforcing some of the highlights with the ivory. And I'm adding some final scratches and blemishes. To finish the blades off, I'm using some pure white to provide some final specular glints to the brightest highlights. And this completes the weapons, leaving just a few areas of the miniature to finish off. I'm now going to highlight the fabric on the legs by adding ivory to the dark sea blue and USA Olive Drab base tone. I'm also adding some yellow for the brightest highlights. I'm now mixing a pale bluish grey and adding a few quick highlights to the scale-like texture at the front. These cooler tones once again providing a welcome contrast to the warmer light of the upper body. Next I'm using some ivory mixed with the orange to add some definition to the handle of the cleaver hanging from the belt. And I'm now highlighting the hands by once again adding Nurgling Green to some Bugman's Glow. I'm also adding some yellow to the highlights on the left hand. I've now chosen to add some red to the knuckle area, which I'm darkening with a little of the Olive Drab and brushing on quite thinly. This is to suggest a slightly raw or bloodied look. And I'm now adding a few final highlights. I'm now returning to my bluish grey to add a few subtle highlights to the sections of chain that are facing away from the lanterns. This is once again to provide a little colour temperature contrast. Next I'm highlighting the small golden rings by adding some ivory to the Japanese uniform. And I'm now adding a final boost to the highlights on the legs as well as the faces. Before moving on to the base, I've chosen to mix a somewhat pale bluish green to add some weathering to the base of the fur cloak. I'm now going to finish off the base just as in the previous episodes, which means applying some simple dry brushing. Along with some selective shading. I'm also adding just a hint of yellowy orange to some of the highlights. I'm now painting the rim in black before gluing the figure to the outer base. And this completes the Butcher. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the episode. As always, you'll find a full paint list and chapter links in the video description. You'll also find links to where I can be found on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, as well as links to the album of music which features several tracks written for the series. My sincerest thanks as always go to the wonderful patrons for their kind support and for making this work possible. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Kingdom Death Monster. Happy painting!